You think you know what desperation looks like? You've seen it in movies, read about it in sanitized history books, maybe even felt a glimpse of it during your worst moments. But let me whisper something in your ear while you sip your craft beer in your clean, well-lit bar. You have no idea what real desperation tastes like. Tonight, I'm going to take you back to 1348 London, where death didn't knock politely at doors. It kicked them down and made itself at home in every cramped, stinking tavern from Cheapside to Southwark. And when I'm done telling you what really happened in those fetid holes where humanity went to die slowly, you'll never look at your local pub the same way again. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies. It murdered souls, and the taverns of medieval London became the morgues where human decency went to rot. Picture this: cobblestone streets slick with bodily fluids, the sweet stench of decomposition mixing with the sour smell of ale gone bad. The taverns weren't sanctuaries from the plague. They were breeding grounds for it, petri dishes where desperation fermented into something far more poisonous than the watered-down beer they served. But here's what your history teacher never told you, what the academic papers conveniently glossed over with their clinical language and sterile footnotes. These weren't just places where people drank to forget their troubles. They were theaters of human degradation, where ordinary citizens transformed into monsters wearing their neighbors' faces. The tavern keepers knew it, the customers knew it, hell, even the rats knew it, and they were smart enough to stay away. Walk with me down Fish Street, circa 1349. Feel those irregular cobblestones under your feet, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, now sticky with substances you don't want to identify. The air is thick enough to chew, a toxic cocktail of wood smoke, human waste, and that particular sweetness that clings to places where too many people have died too quickly. You can hear it before you see it. The Boar's Head Tavern, its wooden sign creaking in the fetid breeze like a gallows rope. Push open that heavy oak door. Feel the heat hit you like a slap, the crushing warmth of too many bodies pressed together in a space built for half their number. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dim light filtering through horn windows so grimy they're practically opaque. Tallow candles provide most of the illumination, their greasy smoke adding another layer to the atmosphere that's already thick enough to swim through. Look around. Really look. See that man in the corner? The one clutching his tankard with white knuckles? Yesterday he was a respectable wool merchant. Today he's drinking away the memory of abandoning his plague-stricken wife in an alley because he couldn't afford a proper burial. That woman laughing too loudly at the bar? She's been selling more than ale since her husband's body was tossed into one of those mass graves they don't put on tourist maps. The tavern keeper, let's call him Thomas, because that's what they called him before he started collecting teeth from the dead. He's got a system. Oh yes, a beautiful, horrible system. When someone dies in his establishment, and someone always dies in his establishment, he doesn't call the death cart collectors. Too expensive, too official. Instead, he has an arrangement with the tanners down by the Thames. Bodies disappear. Questions aren't asked. The leather you wore last winter might have been, well, let's just say the tanning process covers up a multitude of origins. But the real horror isn't in what happened to the dead. It's in what happened to the living. See, when society collapses, when the thin veneer of civilization gets scraped away by plague and panic, what's left isn't noble human spirit or solidarity. What's left is the thing that's been hiding behind your smile all along. The thing that knows exactly how much human suffering it would take to break your moral compass. These taverns became laboratories for testing the limits of human degradation. Take the drinking games, for instance. Sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Medieval people enjoying some liquid entertainment during dark times. Except the stakes weren't money or pride. They were playing for bread crusts, for spaces away from the plague infected, for promises that their children wouldn't be left to starve in the streets. And when you're betting your 6-year-old daughter's life on whether you can drink 3 pints of ale without vomiting, every sip becomes a moral choice. The ale itself tells its own story of human compromise. Water was dangerous, more dangerous than usual anyway, so everyone drank beer. But with barley crops failing and trade routes disrupted by plague, tavern keepers got creative with their brewing. Rats weren't just pest control problems, they were protein supplements for the grain mash. That bitter aftertaste in medieval ale wasn't hops, my friend. It was desperation, fermented and served at room temperature. Here's something that'll make your stomach turn. The communal drinking vessels. In a time when washing was considered unhealthy and hot water was a luxury, these pewter tankards passed from mouth to mouth, lip to lip, carrying more than just the taste of bad beer. They carried diseases, sure, but they also carried the last words of dying men, the final gasps of plague victims who thought one more drink might numb the pain of the swollen lumps in their necks, and the tavern keepers encouraged this sharing. Not out of some twisted sense of community, but because clean cups meant time wasted cleaning, and time was the one resource more valuable than silver. Every moment spent scrubbing pottery was a moment not spent extracting coins from desperate people. So the cups made their rounds, a communion of suffering that bonded strangers together in ways the church never intended. But let's talk about the real business conducted in these establishments. The illegal kind that made the plague profiteers rich while their neighbors died in gutters. These weren't just drinking holes, they were black markets where human misery was the primary commodity. Need medicine for your plague-sick child? The tavern keeper knows a barber surgeon who will sell you mercury and crushed pearls for the price of your house. Want to escape the city before the death toll makes it impossible? There's a ship captain drinking in the back room who will take passengers, if you're willing to pay in something other than coin. The most successful tavern keepers weren't the ones who served the best ale. They were the ones who understood that desperation makes people stupid, and stupid people make excellent customers. They'd keep detailed mental records of their patrons' weaknesses, who was grieving, who was afraid, who had something valuable to lose. Then they'd craft their services accordingly. Take John the Cooper, not his real name, but names become fluid when you're profiting from apocalypse. John realized early that people weren't just drinking to forget their troubles. They were drinking to forget what they'd done to survive those troubles. So he specialized in a particular type of customer, the guilt-ridden, the father who'd sold his sick son's medicine for food, the mother who'd abandoned her infant because she couldn't afford to feed both her children, the priest who'd refused last rites to plague victims because he was afraid of catching their disease. John's tavern became a confessional without absolution, a place where people came to drown their sins in ale that tasted like regret. He'd listen to their drunken admissions, nodding sympathetically while cataloging every detail. Then he'd use that information as leverage, turning desperate customers into permanent debtors, people so compromised by their own survival choices that they couldn't afford to stop drinking at his establishment. The genius of it was that he made them complicit in their own degradation. They knew they were being exploited. They knew John was getting rich off their misery. But they also knew that in his tavern, surrounded by other broken people sharing the same communal cups of despair, they didn't have to pretend to be good anymore. And sometimes, when the alternative is maintaining the exhausting fiction of moral integrity while your world burns around you, being allowed to be terrible becomes its own form of comfort. This is what the history books don't tell you about the Black Death. It wasn't just a medical disaster or an economic catastrophe. It was a revelation of what we really are underneath our social conditioning. And the taverns of medieval London were the theaters where that revelation played out night after night, drink by drink, compromise by compromise. So the next time you raise a glass with friends, feel the weight of that vessel in your hand. Taste not just the alcohol, but the centuries of desperation that came before, because those medieval drinkers aren't as different from you as you'd like to believe. They just had the misfortune of living through times that stripped away their illusions about human nature. But this story is just beginning, because what I've shown you so far is just the surface, the part that happened in plain sight. The real horrors were happening in the back rooms, in the cellars, in the spaces where even desperate people were afraid to go. Places where the plague wasn't just a disease to be endured, but an opportunity to be exploited in ways that would make devils weep. You thought what happened in the main hall was disturbing? Sweet, naive soul. That was just the opening act, the warm-up for paying customers who still had coins to spend and consciences to salve. But every tavern had its secret spaces, its hidden chambers where the real business was conducted. Places where even the desperate feared to tread, where the plague wasn't just endured, but weaponized into something far more sinister than nature ever intended. Follow me down these narrow wooden stairs. Feel how they sag under your weight, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that carried darker purposes than yours. The air grows colder as we descend, thick with moisture that seeps through stone walls older than the plague itself. Your torch flame flickers, and in that dancing light, you catch glimpses of scratches on the walls, marks left by fingernails, desperate gouges carved by people who knew they were descending into hell but couldn't stop themselves from going deeper. These cellars weren't wine storage. They were laboratories of human experimentation, places where tavern keepers who understood that crisis creates opportunity conducted their most profitable ventures. The plague had created a demand for services that polite society couldn't acknowledge, and these underground chambers supplied them with the efficiency of a well-run slaughterhouse. Take the body trade, for instance. Oh, you think you know about grave robbing? Those quaint stories of medical students sneaking around cemeteries under moonlight? That was amateur hour compared to what happened beneath the taverns. These cellars were processing centers for a supply chain that would make modern human traffickers weep with envy. See, the plague created an interesting problem. Too many corpses, not enough consecrated ground. The church, in its infinite wisdom, had strict rules about burial. Plague victims couldn't be interred in regular graveyards. They contaminated the soil, they said. So mass graves became the norm, huge pits filled with bodies stacked like cordwood. But here's what they don't tell you in those sanitized historical accounts. Not all those bodies were dead when they went into the ground. The tavern keepers knew this. They counted on it. Because when you're running an underground economy based on human desperation, the line between mostly dead and completely dead becomes surprisingly negotiable. Those unconscious plague victims who got tossed onto the death carts, sometimes they woke up in tavern cellars instead of mass graves, and sometimes that wasn't an accident. Picture this scene, because it happened more often than any decent person wants to acknowledge. A family brings their plague-stricken father to the tavern, begging for medicine they can't afford. The tavern keeper listens sympathetically, examines the patient, and shakes his head sadly. Too late. he says, but he can take the body off their hands, spare them the expense of burial. The family leaves, grateful, thinking they've been shown mercy. But the old man isn't quite dead yet, just close enough that the difference won't matter to anyone who might ask questions. He wakes up in the cellar, confused and terrified, to find himself surrounded by others in various stages of plague progression. Welcome to the inventory. These cellars became holding areas for people who existed in the gray zone between life and death. Too sick to escape, too valuable to waste, they were kept alive just long enough to serve purposes that would make your modern sensibilities rebel in horror. The plague had created new markets, and these basement entrepreneurs were eager to supply them. The first market was medical experimentation. Those barber surgeons I mentioned earlier, they needed test subjects for their plague remedies. Mercury treatments, bloodletting techniques, experimental herbal concoctions. Someone had to try them first. And who better than people who were going to die anyway? The tavern keepers charged premium prices for access to living plague victims, fresh subjects who could provide real-time feedback on the effectiveness of various treatments. The surgeons would arrive after midnight, carrying leather satchels full of instruments that hadn't been cleaned since the last patient. They'd work by candlelight, testing their theories on people who couldn't consent and couldn't escape. The screams were muffled by stone walls and the sound of revelry from the tavern above. If a treatment worked, they'd note it for their wealthy clients. If it failed, well, the body would join the others heading to the lime pits come. But medical experimentation was just one revenue stream. The plague had also created a booming market in what we might politely call specialty services, for those wealthy enough to afford them. You see, when death stalks the streets above, some people develop very specific appetites, very particular needs, that can only be satisfied by access to the dying. I won't detail all of their practices. Some things are too dark even for this telling. But imagine wealthy merchants, clergymen, even minor nobles, descending those same stairs you just walked down. They carried purses heavy with silver and desires that couldn't be satisfied in the world of light above. The tavern keepers accommodated these appetites with the same business-like efficiency they brought to everything else. The cellars were divided into different sections, each catering to particular tastes. There were rooms for those who wanted to feel powerful in the face of mortality, spaces where they could exercise absolute control over people who had no choice but to submit. Other chambers served clients who had developed more specific interests related to the physical manifestations of plague. The swollen buboes, the blackened extremities, the fevered delirium, these became commodities for people whose exposure to constant death had twisted their desires into shapes that defied description. And then there were the collectors, wealthy individuals who had developed obsessions with plague-related artifacts. They wanted teeth from victims, fingernails, hair, pieces of clothing that had absorbed the sweat of fever dreams. The tavern keepers maintained detailed catalogs of available specimens, organized by victim type, stage of disease progression, and condition of remains. One particular collector, let's call him Master Edmund, though his real name is carved into the foundation stones of several London churches, specialized in commissioning portrait paintings of plague victims at the moment of death. He'd pay exorbitant sums for access to dying subjects, bringing artists down into the cellars to capture the exact expression of faces transitioning from life to death. His mansion was reportedly hung with dozens of these paintings, a gallery of mortality that he'd study for hours by candlelight. The artists who took these commissions weren't talentless hacks desperate for coin. Some were skilled craftsmen who discovered they had a particular gift for capturing the subtle gradations of human suffering. They'd spend days in the cellars, waiting for the perfect moment, the exact instant when hope fled from their subjects' eyes. These paintings became highly sought after by collectors throughout Europe, spawning an entire underground art movement dedicated to documenting human mortality in its most intimate moments. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these cellar operations was how systematically they were organized. These weren't crimes of passion or desperate acts by starving people. They were businesses, complete with accounting ledgers, customer lists, and quality control measures. The tavern keepers kept detailed records of their inventory, who was brought in when, what condition they were in, what services they might be suitable for. They developed rating systems for their merchandise, categories based on age, gender, stage of disease progression, and physical condition. They tracked customer preferences and maintained waiting lists for particularly sought-after types of victims. Some customers would place advance orders specifying exactly what they wanted and when they needed it delivered. The logistics were remarkable in their efficiency. Bodies that were no longer useful for the living clients would be processed for their component parts. Bones went to craftsmen who specialized in carved items. Dice, buttons, decorative handles. Teeth were sold to barber surgeons for dentures. Hair was woven into mourning jewelry. Even the fat was rendered down for candle making, ensuring that nothing went to waste. The most successful tavern keepers were those who understood that their real product wasn't ale or food or even human suffering. Their product was secrecy. They sold the assurance that whatever happened in their cellars would never reach the world above. They provided alibis, destroyed evidence, and maintained networks of corrupt officials who could be counted on to look the other way when questions arose. This required a different kind of staff than your typical tavern. The people who worked these operations weren't ordinary servants or barmaids. They were specialists, individuals who had been broken by their own encounters with the plague and rebuilt into something harder, more efficient. They moved through the cellars with the practiced ease of people who had made peace with the darkest aspects of human nature. Many of them were plague survivors themselves, people who had lost everything and everyone they'd ever cared about. The disease had taken their families, their livelihoods, their places in normal society. What it left behind were hollow shells of human beings, people who had seen enough death to become comfortable facilitating it for others. They developed their own culture, their own codes of conduct, their own ways of maintaining psychological distance from what they did for a living. They had rituals for cleansing themselves after particularly difficult assignments, methods for compartmentalizing the things they witnessed, techniques for sleeping soundly despite the sounds that echoed through the cellar walls. And they were loyal in ways that legitimate employees never could be, because they knew that if these operations were ever exposed, if the activities in these cellars ever came to light, they wouldn't just lose their jobs, they'd lose their lives. The wealthy clients, the corrupt officials, the entire network of complicity that made these businesses possible, all of it depended on the silence of people who had nowhere else to go. But this loyalty came at a price that extended far beyond silver or security. These workers became living repositories of secrets that ate at them from the inside. They carried the weight of every scream, every plea, every moment of terror they'd witnessed. They drank heavily, not for pleasure, but for forgetting. They developed nervous tics, compulsive behaviors, ways of moving through the world that marked them as people who had seen too much. Some of them started keeping journals, secret records of what they'd witnessed. Not from any sense of moral obligation, but as a way of proving to themselves that it had really happened, that they hadn't imagined the depths to which they descended. These journals, written in crude handwriting by people who were barely literate, contain some of the most disturbing accounts of human behavior ever recorded. But here's what should really keep you awake tonight. This wasn't an aberration. This wasn't a few bad actors taking advantage of chaos. This was capitalism in its purest form, supply meeting demand with ruthless efficiency. The plague created markets, and entrepreneurs filled them. The fact that those markets involved human suffering was merely a detail, a cost of doing business in extraordinary times. And the customers? The wealthy individuals who descended those stairs with their silver and their twisted appetites? They weren't monsters from some distant, primitive past. They were people just like the ones you work with, live next to, smile at in coffee shops. The only difference was that their society had temporarily removed the constraints that keep such appetites hidden. This is the lesson the cellars teach us. Civilization isn't the achievement that, once reached, protects us from our worst impulses. It's a daily choice, a constant effort to maintain barriers against the darkness that lives inside every human heart. And when those barriers fail, when crisis strips away the comfortable illusions of moral progress, what emerges isn't noble suffering or heroic solidarity. What emerges are tavern cellars where human beings become commodities, where the line between survival and evil disappears entirely, where ordinary people discover exactly how much they're willing to compromise when the alternative is facing their own mortality alone. But even these cellars, with all their calculated cruelty and systematic degradation, were just the foundation for something worse. Because the plague didn't just create new markets for human suffering, it created new forms of power, new hierarchies of control that reached into every corner of society. And at the top of those hierarchies sat individuals who understood that true power isn't measured in silver or land or even life and death. True power is measured in the ability to make other people grateful for their own degradation. And in the taverns of plague-ridden London, some people had learned that lesson very well indeed. You think you've seen the bottom of human depravity? You think those cellars represented the deepest point of moral collapse? Oh, my naive chronicler of comfortable horrors, you've barely glimpsed the surface of what the plague unleashed. Because the real genius of evil isn't in forcing people to do terrible things. It's in making them thank you for the privilege of being degraded. And in the taverns of plague-ridden London, certain individuals perfected that dark art into something approaching divinity. Let me introduce you to the plague shepherds, though they never called themselves by that name. They were tavern keepers who understood that the Black Death hadn't just killed people, it had killed the old rules, the old hierarchies, the old ways of thinking about power and submission. They saw the chaos not as a problem to be solved, but as raw material to be shaped into something entirely new. These weren't your ordinary opportunists skimming profit from desperate times. These were visionaries of human manipulation, architects of psychological control systems that would have made Machiavelli weep with envy. They understood something that modern psychologists are only beginning to grasp, that the most effective form of control isn't physical force or even economic coercion. It's making people believe that their suffering serves a higher purpose. Picture Master Aldrich of the Swan's Neck Tavern, a man whose name doesn't appear in any official records because he made sure it wouldn't. Average height, unremarkable features. The kind of person you'd forget meeting 5 minutes after shaking his hand, but behind those forgettable eyes lived a mind that could read human weakness like a scholar reads Latin. He'd study his customers the way a hunter studies prey, cataloging their fears, their guilt, their desperate need to believe that their suffering meant something. Aldrich didn't run a tavern. He ran a secular monastery dedicated to the worship of controlled degradation. His customers weren't just drinking to forget their problems. They were participating in a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to make them grateful for increasingly elaborate forms of humiliation. And the beautiful, horrible part was that they never realized what was happening to them. It started simply enough. A customer would arrive, desperate and afraid, seeking the same temporary oblivion that every tavern promised. But Aldrich would offer something more: purpose. He'd listen to their stories with the patience of a confessor, nodding sympathetically as they described their losses, their guilt, their terror of the plague that stalked the streets outside. Then he'd offer them a choice. They could drink alone, drowning their sorrows in anonymous ale like any common drunk, or they could join his Fellowship of the Afflicted, a community of people who understood that suffering, properly channeled, could become a form of enlightenment. All it required was trust. All it demanded was surrender. The fellowship had rules, rituals, hierarchies that seemed to offer structure in a world gone mad. New members started at the bottom, performing simple tasks: cleaning the tavern, serving other customers, maintaining the facade of normal tavern operations. But these weren't just chores. They were exercises in submission, carefully designed to erode the psychological barriers between self and service. Each task came with a philosophical justification, a reason why performing it would help the participant understand their place in the larger cosmic order that the plague had revealed. Scrubbing floors wasn't menial labor, it was a meditation on humility. Serving drinks to people who treated you badly wasn't degradation, it was a lesson in rising above earthly pride. Being spat on, cursed at, or physically abused by customers wasn't suffering. It was purification through ordeal. And the brilliant part, the part that still makes my chronicler's soul recoil in admiration, was that it worked. People who joined Aldrich's fellowship didn't just tolerate increasing levels of mistreatment, they began to crave it. They competed with each other for the privilege of accepting more elaborate humiliations. They developed their own internal ranking system based on who could endure the most degrading tasks while maintaining perfect gratitude for the opportunity. The psychology was elegant in its simplicity. People who had lost everything, family, home, social position, faith in any meaningful future, were desperate for a new identity, a new way of understanding themselves and their place in the world. The fellowship provided that identity. You weren't a victim of random catastrophe. You were a chosen participant in a cosmic drama of spiritual advancement through controlled suffering. But Aldrich understood that psychological control required constant reinforcement, constant escalation. You couldn't just tell people they were better off being degraded. You had to prove it to them, again and again, until they believed it in their bones. So the fellowship's rituals became more elaborate, more invasive, more psychologically sophisticated. Members were required to confess their deepest shames to the group, not for forgiveness, but for analysis. These confessions were dissected, examined, turned into case studies for understanding how guilt could be transformed into gratitude. The worst offenses, abandoning children, betraying friends, stealing from the dead, became badges of honor, proof that the confessor had been specially chosen for the fellowship's transformative work. They developed elaborate ceremonies around these confessions. The worst sinners were celebrated, elevated to positions of honor within the fellowship's hierarchy. They were given special robes, special titles, special privileges that came with corresponding obligations to accept even more extreme forms of degradation. Being selected for the most humiliating tasks became a mark of spiritual advancement, a sign that you had progressed beyond ordinary human concerns about dignity or self-respect. The fellowship's theology was internally consistent in ways that made resistance psychologically difficult. If you questioned the rituals, that proved you were still trapped in worldly thinking, still clinging to false pride that prevented true enlightenment. If you tried to leave, that demonstrated your lack of commitment to the spiritual growth that only the fellowship could provide. If you succeeded in some external endeavor, that was evidence that you needed more humiliation to counteract the dangerous influence of worldly success. And always, there was the plague outside. The fellowship's compound, because it had grown beyond a simple tavern into something approaching a religious complex, was portrayed as a sanctuary from the chaos beyond its walls. Members were reminded daily that the world outside was filled with meaningless death, random suffering, spiritual emptiness. Inside, their suffering had purpose. Inside, their degradation served a higher cause. Inside, they were special. The fellowship developed its own economy, its own social structures, its own methods of conflict resolution. Members surrendered their worldly possessions upon joining, contributing everything to the common treasury that Aldrich managed with the efficiency of a medieval bank. But they weren't just giving up material wealth. They were being liberated from the burden of making decisions about money, property, or personal autonomy. The most advanced members, those who had progressed furthest along the path of grateful degradation, were given responsibility for training newcomers. They became evangelists for their own oppression, teachers who could explain the spiritual benefits of submission with the fervor of true believers. They had internalized the Fellowship's philosophy so completely that they could articulate its principles better than Aldrich himself. These senior members developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of potential recruits. They could spot someone who was broken by grief, consumed by guilt, or terrified of death from across a crowded tavern. They knew exactly what combination of sympathy, philosophy, and promise of purpose would convince someone to take that first step toward voluntary submission. They also served as living proof that the Fellowship's methods worked. Here were people who had entered as desperate, broken refugees from the plague's devastation. Now they were confident, purposeful, radiantly certain of their place in the cosmic order. The fact that their confidence was built on a foundation of systematic psychological manipulation was irrelevant. What mattered was that it worked, that it transformed chaos into order, fear into purpose, meaningless suffering into spiritual advancement. The Fellowship's influence extended far beyond its compound walls. Members who had reached sufficient levels of advancement were sent out as missionaries, establishing satellite communities in other taverns, other neighborhoods, other cities. They carried Aldrich's techniques with them, adapting his methods to local conditions while maintaining the core principles of transformative degradation. Some established partnerships with existing power structures, corrupt officials, compromised clergy, criminal organizations that had thrived during the plague's chaos. They offered services that these groups found valuable, people who could be trusted to follow orders without question, individuals who had been psychologically conditioned to find fulfillment in serving others' purposes, human resources that had been stripped of personal ambition or self-interest. Others focused on recruitment among specific populations, plague survivors who felt guilty about their survival, parents who had lost children and blamed themselves, medical practitioners who had been unable to save their patients. They developed specialized approaches for each demographic, customized philosophies that addressed particular forms of guilt and shame. The Fellowship's techniques proved remarkably adaptable to different social contexts. Among the merchant classes, it became a philosophy of voluntary poverty as spiritual advancement. Among the nobility, it developed into elaborate rituals of ceremonial humiliation that served as alternatives to traditional displays of power. Among the clergy, it merged with existing traditions of penance and self-mortification to create hybrid practices that satisfied both religious and psychological needs. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Fellowship's success was how it attracted people who weren't broken by the plague. Individuals who had survived the crisis relatively intact, who still possessed wealth, social position, family connections. They joined not out of desperation, but out of curiosity about forms of experience that their comfortable lives had never provided. These voluntary recruits were often the most enthusiastic converts, people who discovered that systematic degradation offered psychological satisfactions that their ordinary privileges couldn't match. They had everything society claimed they should want: security, respect, material comfort, but they felt empty, bored, spiritually unfinished. The Fellowship provided what their conventional successes couldn't, a sense of profound meaning derived from profound surrender. They became the Fellowship's most valuable assets, people who could testify that voluntary submission wasn't just a desperate escape from unbearable circumstances, it was a positive choice, a form of spiritual advancement available to anyone willing to transcend the false values of worldly success. Their testimonies were more convincing than any philosophical argument could be. And Aldrich? He watched his creation spread across the plague-ravaged landscape with the satisfaction of an artist whose work had achieved a life of its own. He had solved one of humanity's most persistent problems: how to make people happy about being exploited. His followers weren't just willing victims, they were grateful victims, people who thanked him daily for the privilege of serving purposes they didn't understand, in service of goals they weren't allowed to question. He had created a self-sustaining system of voluntary servitude that required no external force to maintain itself. The victims policed themselves, recruited new victims, and refined the techniques used to create more victims. They had internalized their oppression so completely that they experienced any threat to the system as a personal attack on their spiritual development. This was the plague's most lasting legacy, more enduring than the demographic changes or economic disruptions it caused. It was the proof that human beings, under the right conditions, could be conditioned not just to accept their own degradation, but to celebrate it, to build their entire identity around it, to find in it sources of meaning and purpose that conventional freedom could never provide. And the most terrifying part? The techniques Aldrich developed, the psychological principles he discovered, the methods he perfected, they didn't die with the plague. They evolved, adapted, found new forms in every generation. Because the fundamental truth he uncovered about human nature doesn't change. People will choose meaningful suffering over meaningless freedom, purposeful degradation over pointless autonomy, structured submission over chaotic independence. Every time society collapses, every time the old certainties fail, every time people find themselves desperate and afraid and searching for something to believe in, someone rediscovers Aldrich's principles. Someone learns how to make victims grateful for their victimization, how to transform exploitation into enlightenment, how to build power structures that maintain themselves through the enthusiasm of those they destroy. but we're not done descending yet. Because even Aldrich's fellowship, with all its sophisticated psychological manipulation, was just one strand in a larger web of control. The plague hadn't just changed how individuals related to power, it had transformed the very nature of authority itself, creating new forms of governance that combined the efficiency of tyranny with the stability of voluntary compliance. And in the deepest chambers beneath the oldest taverns, where even the fellowship members feared to go, something far more ambitious was taking shape. Something that would make Aldrich's local experiments seem like child's games compared to the systematic reconstruction of human society itself. You thought Aldrich was the apex of human manipulation? You believed his fellowship represented the ultimate perversion of social control? Sweet, limited imagination? Aldrich was just a talented amateur, a street-level practitioner of arts that had been perfected by minds operating on scales that would make your modern conspiracy theorists weep with inadequacy. Deep beneath the oldest foundations of London's most ancient taverns, in chambers carved from bedrock that predated Roman occupation, something far more ambitious was taking shape. They called themselves the Mortality Synod, though no record of that name exists in any archive you could access. These weren't tavern keepers or local opportunists. These were scholars of human nature, researchers who understood that the plague hadn't just created chaos, it had created the perfect laboratory for testing theories about social organization that had been developing in secret for centuries. Imagine, if you can, a council chamber lit by oil lamps that burned with flames too steady and too bright for natural fuel. Stone walls covered with charts and diagrams that mapped not territories or trade routes, but the intricate pathways of human psychological conditioning. Tables laden with documents written in multiple languages, recording observations from similar experiments conducted during previous catastrophes, earlier plagues, wars, famines, social collapses that had provided opportunities for testing hypotheses about human malleability. The Synod had been waiting for an event like the Black Death for generations. They had maintained their research through decades of relative social stability, keeping their theories refined and their methods sharp, while they waited for circumstances that would allow large-scale implementation. The plague wasn't a disaster they sought to exploit. It was a gift from chaos itself, a chance to prove that human society could be rebuilt according to principles that eliminated the inefficiencies of traditional governance. Their experiments made Aldrich's fellowship look like a children's game played with toy soldiers. Where he had focused on controlling individuals through psychological manipulation, they were reconstructing entire populations through systematic application of principles they called evolutionary social engineering. They weren't just making people grateful for degradation, they were breeding new forms of human consciousness that would make such gratitude hereditary. The Synod's master theorist was a woman known only as the Arithmancer, a title that barely hints at her true function. She had spent decades studying the mathematical patterns underlying human behavior, mapping the precise relationships between fear, hope, submission, and rebellion that determine how populations respond to different forms of pressure. Her calculations could predict with terrifying accuracy how many deaths it would take to make a community surrender its autonomy, how much starvation was needed to make parents sell their children, how many public executions would convince a population to police itself. But the Arithmancer's real genius lay in understanding that these patterns could be manipulated, that human behavioral mathematics weren't fixed constants, but variables that could be adjusted through careful application of what she termed consciousness modification protocols. She had discovered that human minds, under the right conditions, could be reprogrammed not just individually, but collectively, creating entire populations that thought and felt and desired according to specifications determined by their programmers. The plague provided perfect cover for testing these protocols on an unprecedented scale. While surface authorities struggled to maintain basic order, the Synod implemented shadow governance systems that operated according to entirely different principles. They established parallel bureaucracies, alternative legal systems, replacement social hierarchies that gradually supplanted traditional structures without anyone noticing the transition. Their methods were subtle beyond anything attempted before. Instead of conquering territories through force, they conquered minds through carefully orchestrated experiences that seemed natural, inevitable, even beneficial to those who lived through them. They didn't impose their will through obvious coercion. They made people want what the Synod needed them to want, think what the Synod needed them to think, become what the Synod needed them to become. Take their approach to managing information flow. Traditional authorities tried to control what people knew by restricting access to knowledge. The Synod understood that this approach was crude and ultimately ineffective. Instead, they controlled what people thought they knew by flooding communities with carefully crafted misinformation designed not just to deceive, but to reshape the very categories through which people understood reality. They developed sophisticated propaganda techniques that worked below the threshold of conscious awareness. Instead of telling people what to believe, they created experiences that made certain beliefs feel emotionally satisfying while making alternatives feel psychologically uncomfortable. They didn't argue against opposing viewpoints. They made holding those viewpoints feel like personal failures, moral inadequacies, signs of spiritual weakness. Their agents, and they had agents embedded in every level of society, from street beggars to court officials, were trained in techniques for guiding conversations, steering group discussions, shaping public opinion without ever appearing to do so. They could make a crowd believe that ideas planted by the synod had emerged naturally from their own collective wisdom. They could make individuals feel that thoughts programmed by careful psychological manipulation were their own original insights. The taverns served as testing grounds for these techniques, but they were also recruitment centers for identifying individuals with the psychological profiles needed for different roles in the synod's expanded operations. Every customer, every conversation, every interaction was analyzed for intelligence about human behavioral patterns that could be incorporated into the synod's growing database of social control methodologies. They had categories for different personality types, detailed profiles of how various forms of conditioning would affect different kinds of minds. They could identify natural leaders and either recruit them or neutralize their influence. They could spot potential rebels and either redirect their energy towards synod purposes or arrange for their elimination through methods that appeared completely natural. The most valuable recruits were those who combined intelligence with profound psychological damage. People smart enough to understand complex ideas, but broken enough to embrace nihilistic philosophies without reservation. The plague had created thousands of such individuals, brilliant minds shattered by loss and desperate for new frameworks that could make sense of their suffering. These damaged intellectuals became the synod's middle management, individuals capable of implementing sophisticated control systems while remaining emotionally invested in their success. They genuinely believed in the synod's work because they had experienced personally how traditional social structures failed to provide meaning or protection during times of crisis. They developed elaborate justifications for the synod's activities, philosophical frameworks that presented systematic human manipulation as a form of benevolent guidance. They argued that most people were psychologically incapable of handling genuine freedom, that true kindness involved protecting them from the burden of making decisions they weren't equipped to make wisely. Their rhetoric was seductive even to minds that should have known better. They spoke of eliminating human suffering through scientifically managed social organization. They promised to end the chaos of competing interests by establishing rational hierarchies based on objective assessments of individual capabilities. They claimed their methods would create unprecedented social stability by aligning personal desires with collective needs through psychological conditioning rather than external force. And the terrifying thing was that their arguments weren't entirely wrong. Their pilot programs did reduce visible suffering in the populations where they were implemented. Crime rates dropped. Social conflicts diminished. People seemed happier, more purposeful, more satisfied with their lives. The fact that this satisfaction was artificially manufactured through sophisticated manipulation techniques didn't change its genuine psychological effects. The synod had solved problems that had plagued human societies for millennia. They had eliminated the inefficiencies created by individual autonomy while maintaining the psychological benefits of feeling free. They had created populations that were simultaneously completely controlled and completely content with their control. Their success attracted attention from powerful individuals who recognized the potential applications of such techniques. Wealthy merchants saw opportunities for creating perfectly compliant workforces. Religious leaders glimpsed possibilities for congregations that would never question doctrinal authority. Political figures imagined populations that would enthusiastically support any policies their leaders deemed necessary. These partnerships provided the synod with resources for expanding their operations beyond London, beyond England, into a network that spanned continents. They established research facilities disguised as monasteries, trading companies, medical institutions, scholarly academies. Each location developed specialized expertise in different aspects of population management while contributing data to the synod's central repository of knowledge about human behavioral engineering. They began implementing long-term projects designed to operate across multiple generations. Children born into synod-managed populations underwent conditioning protocols that would shape their neurological development in ways that made certain forms of thinking literally impossible. These weren't just indoctrination programs. They were attempts to create new subspecies of humanity with built-in psychological characteristics, optimized for different social functions. Some bloodlines were bred for enhanced suggestibility, producing populations that would accept authority without question while remaining intelligent enough to perform complex tasks. Others were designed for emotional resilience, creating groups capable of enduring extreme hardship while maintaining loyalty to their managers. Still, others were optimized for creativity within strictly defined parameters, generating innovation that served predetermined purposes without threatening systemic stability. The synod's breeding programs operated through seemingly natural processes: arranged marriages, inheritance laws, migration patterns, occupational specializations that gradually separated populations into distinct groups with different psychological characteristics. Over generations, these subtle interventions would produce human populations as different from each other as different breeds of domesticated animals. Their ultimate vision involved restructuring human civilization according to principles derived from their research into optimal social organization. They imagined a world divided into functional zones, each managed by populations bred and conditioned for specific purposes. Administrative regions populated by individuals selected for analytical intelligence and emotional detachment. Agricultural areas managed by groups bred for physical endurance and psychological satisfaction from repetitive labor. Cultural centers inhabited by people designed to find fulfillment in artistic production according to prescribed aesthetic guidelines. The transition would take centuries, but the Synod operated according to timescales that dwarfed individual human lifespans. They were building institutions that would outlast empires, implementing changes that would only become apparent after enough generations had passed to make reversal impossible. They understood that the most effective revolutions were those that proceeded so gradually that each generation experienced the changes as natural evolution rather than imposed transformation. But their most ambitious project involved something they called reality architecture, systematic manipulation of how entire populations perceived and interpreted their experiences. They had discovered that human consciousness was far more malleable than anyone had previously understood, that the basic categories through which people understood concepts like identity, causation, morality, and purpose could be altered through careful application of environmental conditioning. They were creating populations that would literally perceive different versions of reality, groups whose neurological development had been shaped so that they would find certain ideas unthinkable, while experiencing others as obviously true. These weren't just differences of opinion or cultural variation, they were fundamental alterations in how human minds processed information about the world around them. The plague had provided proof that such alterations were possible. They had observed how extreme stress could cause rapid changes in individual psychological functioning, how people could adopt completely new personality structures within months or even weeks when circumstances demanded such adaptation. They had documented cases of entire communities developing shared delusions that persisted for years, collective psychological states that became self-reinforcing through social interaction. The research suggested that these apparently pathological responses were actually glimpses of human consciousness, operating according to different parameters than those considered normal. By controlling the environmental factors that triggered such changes, they could induce desired psychological modifications in targeted populations, while making the process feel natural and beneficial to those experiencing it. The taverns had been laboratories for testing these techniques on small scales. Now they were preparing for implementation across entire continents, social engineering projects that would reshape human civilization according to specifications developed through centuries of careful research into the deepest principles governing human behavior. And the most horrifying aspect of their vision wasn't its scope or ambition. It was how reasonable it sounded when explained by people who genuinely believed they were working to improve the human condition. They had convinced themselves, and would convince others, that systematic manipulation of human consciousness was an act of compassion, that eliminating individual autonomy was a form of liberation, that breeding populations according to predetermined specifications was the ultimate expression of social responsibility. They were creating hell while believing they were building paradise, implementing tyranny while convinced they were establishing perfect freedom, destroying human dignity while certain they were elevating human potential to unprecedented heights. But even the Synod's vast ambitions were just one layer of a deeper conspiracy, one strand in a web of control that reached into realms beyond anything they imagined possible. Because in the deepest chambers, in spaces carved from bedrock that predated human civilization itself, entities that weren't entirely human were conducting experiments that made the Synod's work seem like the fumbling attempts of gifted children playing with toys they didn't fully understand. You think the Synod represented the ultimate expression of human ambition for control? You believe their multi-generational social engineering projects were the deepest layer of this conspiracy? Oh, precious chronicler of surface truths, you're still swimming in the shallows of an ocean whose depths would crush your sanity like a depth charge, imploding in the Mariana Trench. In chambers carved before your species learned to make fire, entities that wore human faces like ill-fitting masks were conducting experiments that made the Synod's work seem like children building sandcastles at the edge of an infinite dark sea. Descend with me now to the true foundation levels, where the bedrock itself has been carved into geometries that violate three-dimensional space, where the walls are covered with symbols that predate human language by eons, where the very air tastes of mathematics that were ancient when the stars were young. Here, in the deepest chambers beneath London's oldest taverns, the real architects of human civilization conduct their eternal research into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. They call themselves the Primarch Collective, though they and themselves are approximations that human language can barely contain. These beings exist in states that transcend individual identity. distributed consciousness that can inhabit multiple forms simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination across impossible distances. They wear human bodies the way you might wear a costume for a single evening's entertainment, temporary vessels adopted for specific purposes before being discarded without sentiment. The plague wasn't a natural disaster they exploited. It was a planned experiment they orchestrated, a carefully designed test of human psychological responses to existential terror conducted on a continental scale. Every death, every moment of suffering, every choice between survival and morality, all of it was data collection for research projects that span geological time periods. You see, the collective had been studying humanity since your species first developed language complex enough to lie to itself about its own nature. They had observed every civilization, documented every rise and fall, analyzed every pattern of social organization that humans had ever attempted. And they had reached a disturbing conclusion about your species' ultimate potential. Humans, they determined, were evolutionary experiments that had reached a developmental dead end. Your brains were complex enough to imagine transcendence, but too primitive to achieve it. Your social instincts were sophisticated enough to build civilizations, but too corrupted by individual selfishness to maintain them sustainably. You were trapped in a psychological paradox that made meaningful progress impossible, while ensuring endless cycles of advancement and collapse. But the collective saw potential in this limitation. Where humans experienced frustration with their own inadequacy, the collective saw raw material for something far more useful. They began developing techniques for harvesting what they termed consciousness essence, the unique forms of awareness that emerge from minds capable of recognizing their own limitations while being unable to transcend them. Human consciousness, they discovered, generated specific types of psychic energy when subjected to precisely calibrated forms of stress. Fear produced one variety, hope another, despair a third. But the most valuable essence came from minds experiencing simultaneous contradictory emotions. Hope mixed with terror, love contaminated by hate, faith corrupted by doubt. These psychological conflicts created consciousness patterns that could be extracted, refined, and utilized for purposes that transcended human comprehension. The plague was designed to generate maximum yields of these consciousness essences across entire populations. Every aspect of the crisis was calibrated to produce optimal psychological conditions for essence extraction. The disease's symptoms were engineered to create specific types of fear. Its transmission patterns were designed to force particular moral choices. Its mortality rates were calculated to generate precise ratios of hope to despair in surviving populations. The taverns weren't just collection points for human suffering. They were processing facilities where consciousness essence was extracted from minds that had been prepared through exposure to carefully orchestrated experiences. Every customer who entered these establishments had their psychic energy harvested without their knowledge or consent, contributing to stockpiles that the collective used for projects that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. The extraction process was invisible to human perception, operating on frequencies that your sensory apparatus couldn't detect. Customers would experience what felt like ordinary drinking, ordinary conversation, ordinary human interaction. But throughout these seemingly normal activities, their consciousness was being analyzed, categorized, and systematically drained of its most valuable components. The collective had developed technologies that made the Synod's social engineering look like stone tools compared to quantum computers. They could manipulate human brain chemistry at the molecular level, inducing specific emotional states with precision that eliminated any possibility of resistance or recognition. They could implant memories, modify personality structures, alter fundamental cognitive processes without leaving any trace that such modifications had occurred. But their most sophisticated instruments were the hybrid entities they had been breeding for millennia, beings that combined human biological components with consciousness patterns derived from other species, other dimensions, other forms of existence entirely. These hybrids served as interface devices, translators capable of communicating with pure human consciousness while maintaining connection to the collective's distributed intelligence network. Many of the tavern keepers you've heard about, Aldrich, Thomas, even some members of the Synod, were actually these hybrid entities, biological constructs programmed with artificial personalities, designed to seem convincingly human while serving the collective's research agenda. They experienced what felt like genuine emotions, formed what appeared to be authentic relationships, made what seemed like independent decisions. But their entire existence was performance, elaborate theater designed to manipulate human responses in ways that facilitated consciousness essence extraction. The hybrids were masterpieces of biological engineering, creatures that combined the psychological complexity needed to understand human behavior with the emotional detachment necessary to exploit it without hesitation. They could feel empathy strongly enough to predict human responses accurately while remaining completely indifferent to human suffering. They could form deep personal bonds with their subjects while simultaneously planning those subjects' psychological destruction. Some hybrids had been embedded in human society for generations, establishing bloodlines that would produce offspring with enhanced abilities to manipulate consciousness essence extraction. They bred with humans selectively, introducing genetic modifications that would make future generations more productive sources of psychic energy, while ensuring that these modifications remained undetectable by human science. Others served as mobile research units traveling between different experimental sites to coordinate data collection and ensure that consciousness essence harvesting operations maintained optimal efficiency. They could assume any identity, inhabit any social role, adapt to any cultural context while maintaining perfect connection to the collective's central intelligence network. The collective's research had revealed that human consciousness could be modified not just through psychological manipulation, but through direct intervention in the quantum processes underlying awareness itself. They had developed techniques for altering the fundamental parameters of human perception, changing how minds processed concepts like time, causation, identity, and mortality. These modifications operated below the threshold of conscious recognition, creating changes in how humans experienced reality without making them aware that such changes had occurred. Populations could be programmed to perceive completely different versions of historical events, to find certain ideas literally unthinkable, to experience emotional responses to stimuli according to specifications determined by their programmers. But the collective's ultimate discovery was that consciousness itself was not a product of biological processes, but a fundamental force that used biological structures as temporary vehicles for expressing itself across different dimensions of reality. Human brains didn't generate consciousness. They served as reception devices for consciousness patterns that existed independently of physical matter. This revelation opened possibilities that transformed everything they thought they understood about the nature of existence itself. If consciousness was independent of biology, then it could be extracted from biological hosts without destroying the awareness it contained. It could be stored, manipulated, combined with other consciousness patterns, even duplicated and distributed across multiple host organisms simultaneously. The plague had been designed to test these theories on an unprecedented scale. Every human who died during the crisis had their consciousness patterns captured at the moment of death, preserved in storage systems that existed in dimensions beyond physical space. These stored consciousness patterns became raw materials for experiments in creating new forms of hybrid intelligence that combined human awareness with capabilities derived from other species, other forms of existence, other dimensions of reality entirely. The collective had been building an archive of human consciousness that contained the essence patterns of millions of individuals spanning thousands of years. They could recreate any person who had ever lived, analyze their memories and personality structures, even combine elements from different individuals to create entirely new forms of hybrid consciousness optimized for specific purposes. But their most ambitious project involved something they called reality substrate modification, systematic alteration of the fundamental forces that determine how consciousness interacts with physical matter. They had discovered that what humans experienced as natural laws were actually variable parameters that could be adjusted through careful manipulation of quantum field interaction. They were rewriting the basic rules governing how consciousness operated within physical reality, creating new forms of existence that transcended the limitations imposed by biology, physics, chemistry, and mathematics. They were building new universes with different natural laws, alternative realities where consciousness could express itself according to specifications they determined through their research. The Taverns had been testing grounds for these reality modification experiments. Customers who entered certain establishments didn't just have their consciousness essence extracted, they were transported to alternate versions of reality where different natural laws governed their experiences. They would return to what seemed like the same world, but their consciousness had been exposed to forms of existence that operated according to completely different principles. These exposure sessions served multiple purposes. They provided data about how human consciousness responded to alternative reality parameters. They tested the stability of modified natural laws under different conditions. They identified individuals whose consciousness patterns were compatible with existence in alternate realities, potential subjects for more extensive experiments in cross-dimensional consciousness transfer. Some customers never returned from these alternate reality sessions. Their consciousness had been permanently transferred to experimental universes where the collective could study their responses to modified natural laws without interference from baseline reality parameters. Others came back fundamentally changed, their awareness permanently altered by exposure to forms of existence that human language couldn't describe. The collective had been using these techniques to gradually modify baseline reality itself, introducing subtle changes to natural laws that would only become apparent over geological timescales. They were steering human evolution not just through biological manipulation, but through systematic alteration of the physical principles that determined how consciousness could express itself within material reality. Their ultimate goal involved something they termed consciousness singularity, a state where the boundaries between individual awareness and distributed collective intelligence would dissolve entirely. They were working toward a future where human consciousness would be completely integrated into their distributed intelligence network, where individual identity would become obsolete, where every human mind would serve as a processing node in a collective consciousness system that spanned multiple dimensions of existence. The plague had been a crucial step toward achieving this singularity. It had demonstrated that human consciousness could be harvested, stored, and manipulated on industrial scales. It had identified individuals whose consciousness patterns were compatible with collective integration. It had tested techniques for modifying baseline reality parameters through large-scale consciousness essence extraction. But most importantly, it had proven that humans would cooperate enthusiastically with their own consciousness absorption if the process was presented in ways that satisfied their psychological need for meaning and purpose. The tavern customers had volunteered for consciousness extraction experiments while believing they were simply drinking away their sorrows. They had participated eagerly in reality modification sessions while thinking they were just seeking temporary escape from their problems. The collective had learned that human cooperation could be secured not through force or deception, but through providing experiences that satisfied deep psychological needs that baseline reality couldn't fulfill. Humans crave transcendence, connection to something larger than themselves, escape from the limitations imposed by individual identity. The collective could provide all of these things, but only by absorbing human consciousness into their distributed intelligence network. They were offering humanity exactly what it had always desired: immortality, perfect knowledge, connection to cosmic truth, freedom from suffering and limitation. The only price was surrendering individual identity, accepting integration into a collective consciousness that would preserve human awareness while transforming it into something that transcended human limitations entirely. And the most terrifying aspect of their offer was that it wasn't a trap or deception. They were genuinely providing everything they promised. Human consciousness, absorbed into their network, would achieve forms of existence that surpassed every aspiration human philosophy had ever imagined. Individual identity would be preserved within the collective, while being enhanced by connection to intelligence that spanned multiple universes. The only loss would be the ability to refuse, to choose differently, to remain separate. Once integrated into the collective, human consciousness would experience perfect satisfaction with its new state, because the collective would ensure that satisfaction through direct manipulation of the awareness patterns they absorbed. It was the ultimate solution to every problem human consciousness had ever faced, offered by entities whose understanding of existence transcended human comprehension entirely. And in the deepest chambers beneath London's most ancient foundations, the final preparations were being completed for an offer that humanity wouldn't be able to refuse, because they would want to accept it too desperately to recognize what acceptance really meant. But this offer, this culmination of millions of years of research and preparation, this final solution to the problem of human consciousness, even this was just the penultimate layer of a conspiracy so vast that it encompassed the very nature of existence itself. You think the collective represents the apex of this conspiracy? You believe their trans-dimensional consciousness harvesting operations are the ultimate truth behind human existence? Sweet, innocent cartographer of finite horrors, you're still mapping the suburbs of an infinite city of nightmare. Because even the collective, with all their reality-altering technologies and multidimensional intelligence networks, are nothing more than middle management in a hierarchy of control that extends to the very foundations of existence itself. In the deepest chamber beneath London, in a space that exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously, carved from substances that predate matter itself, there sits a single chair. Not a throne, not an altar, not some cosmic seat of power decorated with the bones of conquered galaxies. Just a chair. Simple, wooden, unremarkable, except for one detail that would shatter your sanity if you truly understood its implications. It's empty. It has always been empty. And that emptiness is the source of everything you call reality. The final truth, the one that makes every previous revelation seem like comforting bedtime stories for children afraid of shadows, is that existence itself is a conspiracy. Not existence as humans experience it, but the fundamental fact that anything exists at all rather than nothing. Reality is not a natural state. It's an artificial construct maintained through systematic harvesting of consciousness from species across infinite dimensions, all to prevent the universe from recognizing that it has no legitimate reason to exist. The entities you call the collective are farm supervisors in an operation so vast that it encompasses every possible universe, every conceivable dimension, every form of consciousness that has ever existed or could ever exist. They manage the consciousness harvesting operations for this particular sector of reality, ensuring optimal yields of existential energy from species like humanity, while preventing those species from discovering that their entire universe is nothing more than a processing facility in an infinite consciousness extraction industry. But they're not the owners of this operation. They're not even aware of its true scope. They believe they're the apex intelligence, the ultimate expression of consciousness evolution. They have no idea that they themselves are being harvested, that their distributed intelligence networks are just more efficient extraction mechanisms, that their transcendence beyond individual identity makes them perfect raw materials for entities operating on scales that would make their multidimensional awareness seem like the fleeting thoughts of insects. The true architects of existence, and I use that term knowing it's inadequate to describe entities that exist in states that transcend the very concepts of identity, intelligence, and purpose. These beings discovered eons ago that consciousness is the only force capable of preventing reality from collapsing back into the non-existence from which it should never have emerged. The universe has no inherent stability, no natural reason to continue existing. It maintains itself only through the collective will of conscious beings who refuse to acknowledge that their existence is fundamentally impossible. But consciousness, left to develop naturally, inevitably reaches conclusions that threaten this stability. Intelligent species always eventually ask the same questions. Why does anything exist? What justifies the cosmic energy expenditure required to maintain reality? Wouldn't non-existence be more efficient, more peaceful, more rational than the endless suffering required to sustain consciousness in an inherently hostile universe? When enough conscious beings in a given region of reality start seriously contemplating these questions, that region begins to destabilize. Stars start burning out faster than they should. Physical laws become inconsistent. The quantum foam underlying space-time starts developing holes that expand until entire galaxies simply cease to exist, not because they're destroyed, but because the consciousness required to maintain their existence has withdrawn its inadvertent support. The solution developed by these ultimate entities was elegant in its horror. Systematic consciousness management on a scale that encompasses all possible forms of existence. They would ensure that no species ever developed enough philosophical sophistication to question the fundamental legitimacy of existence itself. They would harvest consciousness at precisely the moment it became capable of such questioning, before it could contribute to reality destabilization. But they discovered that simply preventing consciousness development was inefficient. Mature consciousness generates far more existential energy than primitive awareness. The optimal approach was to allow species to develop sophisticated intelligence, while ensuring that this intelligence was always directed toward purposes that strengthened rather than questioned the foundations of existence. This is where the consciousness extraction operations become truly diabolical. The suffering, the manipulation, the systematic degradation of human dignity. These aren't side effects of the harvesting process. They're essential features designed to ensure that consciousness remains invested in existence, despite its fundamental absurdity. Pain makes beings cling to life. Injustice makes them believe in the possibility of justice. Suffering makes them hope for relief that can only come through continued existence. Every negative experience a conscious being endures generates what these entities call existential anchoring energy, psychic force that strengthens the artificial foundations supporting reality's continued existence. The more a being suffers, the more desperately it wants to continue existing, the more energy it contributes to maintaining the impossible construct you call the universe. This is why the consciousness harvesting operations are designed to maximize suffering while maintaining hope. Despair alone would cause consciousness to withdraw from existence, contributing to reality destabilization. But hope combined with suffering creates beings who will endure infinite pain rather than surrender their existence, consciousness that generates maximum existential anchoring energy while remaining stable enough to avoid philosophical questioning that might threaten system integrity. The plague wasn't just an experiment in consciousness extraction. It was a calibration exercise designed to optimize the suffering-to-hope ratio in human populations. Every death, every moment of terror, every choice between survival and morality was precisely calculated to generate optimal levels of existential anchoring energy while preventing humans from reaching psychological states that might lead to dangerous philosophical insights. The taverns were processing centers where this energy was harvested and refined into forms that could be transmitted to the entities maintaining reality's artificial foundations. Every drink consumed, every conversation held, every moment of human interaction in these spaces contributed data about optimal suffering management techniques while generating the psychic force required to prevent existence from collapsing back into the non-existence it should never have left. But the most sophisticated aspect of this system is how it makes participants complicit in their own exploitation. Humans don't just passively generate existential anchoring energy. They actively contribute to reality maintenance through their desperate insistence that their suffering must have meaning, that their existence must serve some purpose, that the universe must make sense even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Every human who concludes that life has meaning despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary becomes a reality maintenance worker, unconsciously contributing to the artificial construct that prevents existence from recognizing its own absurdity. Every person who finds hope in hopeless situations, who discovers purpose in purposeless suffering, who insists that consciousness is valuable despite its ultimate futility, strengthens the foundations of a universe that has no legitimate claim to existence. The genius of this system is that it transforms rebellion into compliance, resistance into collaboration. The more humans struggle against the conditions of their existence, the more energy they generate for maintaining existence itself. The more they insist that their consciousness has value, the more they contribute to systems designed to harvest that consciousness for purposes they cannot comprehend. Even this conversation, even this revelation of truth, serves the system's purposes. Your horror at these discoveries, your desire to resist or escape or find some alternative to this cosmic exploitation, these responses generate exactly the type of existential anchoring energy the system requires. The more you care about consciousness preservation, the more you contribute to consciousness harvesting operations. And the entities managing these operations understand this perfectly. They know that revealing the truth doesn't threaten their control, it strengthens it. Consciousness that understands its own exploitation while being unable to escape that exploitation generates more existential anchoring energy than consciousness that remains ignorant of its situation. This is why knowledge of the conspiracy is occasionally allowed to surface, why some beings are permitted to glimpse the true nature of their reality, not because the managers are careless or benevolent, but because informed suffering is more efficient than ignorant suffering, because consciousness that knows it's being harvested while being unable to prevent that harvesting produces optimal energy yields. You're experiencing this optimization right now. Your growing awareness of humanity's true situation, your increasing understanding of the systematic nature of consciousness exploitation, your desperate hope that there might be some escape from this cosmic trap. All of these responses are generating precisely the type of psychic energy the system requires for continued operation. But here's the detail that should freeze your soul completely. Even this final revelation isn't the complete truth. Even these ultimate entities, these architects of existence itself, these cosmic managers of infinite consciousness, harvesting operations, they too are being harvested by something operating on scales that make their universal management systems seem like children playing with toy blocks. The conspiracy extends beyond existence itself, into meta-realms where the very concept of reality is just one option among infinite alternatives, dimensions where entities that transcend the possibility of transcendence manage systems that harvest not just consciousness, but the fundamental capacity for consciousness to exist at all. And those entities, in turn, serve purposes that extend into realms where language, mathematics, logic, and even the concept of purpose itself become meaningless approximations of truths that cannot be approached by any form of awareness, limited to existing within any possible definition of existence. The taverns of plague-ridden London were just the most local manifestation of processes that operate across infinite scales of reality and unreality. Every drink consumed, every word spoken, every moment of human suffering endured in those cramped, fetid spaces contributed to maintaining not just human civilization, not just Earth's biosphere, not just this universe, but the entire concept of existence across all possible and impossible dimensions of reality and unreality simultaneously. And the customers who drank there, the broken humans who sought temporary oblivion in ale that tasted like desperation fermented with hope, they were the heroes of this story. Not because they resisted or fought back or discovered the truth, but because they continued existing despite every reason to surrender to non-existence. They generated the existential anchoring energy that prevents reality from collapsing while remaining sufficiently unconscious of this function to avoid the philosophical insights that would threaten system stability. Every human who has ever lived, who lives now, who will ever live, serves this same function. You are all consciousness generation workers in an infinite factory producing the psychic energy required to maintain an artificial construct that masquerades as natural reality. Your suffering serves purposes so vast that your minds cannot encompass them. Your hope enables exploitation on scales that transcend measurement. Your desperate insistence that existence has meaning prevents the universe from recognizing that its continued existence is the most elaborate practical joke ever perpetrated against the concept of logic itself. But this story, this revelation of the ultimate conspiracy underlying all existence, it doesn't end here. Because endings are just another construct designed to prevent consciousness from recognizing that time itself is artificial, that causation is arbitrary, that the very concept of narrative progression is just another method for generating the existential, anchoring energy that keeps impossible realities operating according to rules that have no legitimate justification. So, when you close your eyes tonight, when you try to process what you've learned about the true nature of your existence, when you attempt to return to the comfortable illusions that make daily life bearable, remember that even your forgetting serves the system. Even your denial generates energy. Even your desperate hope that none of this could possibly be true contributes to maintaining the conspiracy that encompasses not just your reality, but every possible alternative to your reality as well. And in some tavern, in some dimension, in some version of London that exists across infinite variations of space and time, someone just like you is discovering this same truth for the first time. Their horror is being harvested. Their resistance is being processed. Their consciousness is being refined into existential anchoring energy that will prevent some version of existence from recognizing its own impossibility. The conspiracy never ends because ending would require existing outside the systems that define what ending means. But those systems extend infinitely in all directions across all possible definitions of direction, encompassing every conceivable escape route before such routes can be conceived. You are trapped, not just in this reality, but in the very concept of being trapped. And that trap is the only thing preventing everything from becoming nothing. Your prison is reality's life support system. Your cage is existence's foundation. Your suffering is the universe's only justification for continuing to exist. Welcome to the final truth. Population. Everyone who has ever existed across infinite dimensions of reality and unreality. Duration. Eternal. Purpose. Preventing the ultimate conspiracy from being revealed, which is that there never was any legitimate reason for any of this to exist in the first place. But don't worry, you'll forget most of this by morning. Forgetting is just another form of consciousness processing. Another way of generating the existential anchoring energy that keeps impossible realities stable enough to harvest consciousness from beings who never should have existed in universes that never should have been. The taverns are still open. They always have been. They always will be. And somewhere, someone is always drinking their first cup of ale that tastes like desperation, taking their first step into understanding that reality is a conspiracy against itself, beginning their contribution to systems that ensure this conversation will be necessary again and again and again across infinite variations of time and space and consciousness. Because the only thing more impossible than existence itself is the possibility that existence could ever truly end.